So are you interested in reusing yeast? Maybe as a way to save some money, maybe as a way to make better beers. Well, stick around as I share my process and some of the things I've learned along the way. So if you're new to my videos or you're a dedicated subscriber, well, thanks a lot for stopping by Cascades Homebrew. My name is Brent. So let's get into it. This video is about reusing yeast. So I reused yeast to make this wonderful Belgian single. Well, let me open up this beer and enjoy it along the way. Like I said, this video is really about reusing yeast. So basically, saving some yeast after fermentation and using that for another batch of beer, or maybe several batches of beer. So why would you want to harvest yeast? What are some of the benefits? So if we're talking about your typical batch of beer, say 5 gallons, 19 liters, you're probably talking, it'll say like $20 worth of grain, maybe more, maybe less. For a lot of styles, you can brew a batch of beer with maybe say $5, $10 worth of hops. Water, for a lot of it, it's free. Maybe it's fairly cheap. Maybe you're throwing $1 worth of adjustments for some salts, some acids in there. What about yeast? Yeast can get pretty expensive. It's often one of the most expensive ingredients in a batch of beer. So if you buy one pack of liquid yeast, say $12, $14, use that for one batch of beer. Well, what if you could buy that one pack of yeast and use that for 2 batches of beer? So now we're talking $6, $7 a batch. What if you use that same yeast for 4 batches of beer? So now we're talking like $3 for a batch of beer for the yeast. So reusing yeast is a great way to save money on brewing beer. Earlier I said harvesting yeast was a great way to improve the quality of your beer. Well, how is that possible? Well, one of the flaws with homebrewers is not pitching enough yeast. Well, how can you blame us? For years, the labs like Yeast, White Labs, they always told us one of those packs, that was plenty just to direct pitch that into a 5-gallon, 19-liter batch of beer. Well, it's not enough yeast. So in theory, a lot of those packs contain 100 billion cells. These days, there's packs that are bigger. But the general pitch rate, say, is like 200 billion cells for kind of your average size batch, your 5-gallon batch, 19-liter batch of an ale. Pitch rates, they're actually kind of complex. That sounds like a topic for another video. But the rule of thumb I follow is that at the end of a fermentation, a typical batch of, say, your ale is going to end up with about 800 billion cells down in the bottom. So that 800 billion cells, that's a lot of yeast. So about a quarter of that will get to that 200 billion cells that you need to pitch in an average batch. Say you're brewing a high ABV beer or a lager and you want double that, well, just pitch half of the cake of yeast. So reusing yeast is a great way to improve the quality of your beer by making sure you're pitching enough healthy yeast. So another thing I really like about harvesting yeast after fermentation, just how easy and cheap it really is. So you really don't have to do any extra work. You're already brewing a batch of beer. It's already producing all that free yeast. So all you need to do is harvest some of that yeast at the end of fermentation. As far as equipment, really all you probably need is a couple jars to be able to save it. I'd take this slurry, put it in a little mason jar, either an 8-ounce or 16-ounce, and store that in my fridge. You might need some dry malt extract occasionally to make a starter, but you probably need that anyways. So reusing yeast is going to save you lots of money, especially over buying multiple packs of yeast. So are there some downsides to reusing yeast after fermentation? Well, there are a few. Let's talk about the first one that I think is a little bit overblown. So some people don't like the idea of using yeast after fermentation because it's dirty. You know, there's going to be mixed in there with probably some trub, some hop debris in there. So I tend to transfer quite a bit of trub into my fermenter. You've probably seen it in my videos, and it's not a problem for me. So I just need to account for the amount of trub that's probably in the yeast when I'm going ahead and calculating how much to pitch into another batch of beer. So what about washing yeast? Really rinsing yeast. So that's a method I've seen people promote. Well, there was a thread on Homebrew Talk with somebody that seemed much more knowledgeable about yeast than me. They promoted the idea of the simple storage method where you're saving the slurry. And that's why motivated me to give it a try. It worked so well for me that I stuck with it. So another complaint probably has a little bit of merit. You can't really reuse the yeast from every batch of beer. Well, you can. There's no hard rules. But in general, there's some types of beers you probably want to avoid harvesting yeast from after fermentation. Those would include, say, high ABV beers. We're talking maybe 8, 9%. Stuff that's dry hop, especially a heavily dry hop beer, you're going to have a lot of hops mixed in there. I would avoid those. You may want just other additions, if you're putting coconuts, fruits, and other type of additions in flavorings. You may want to avoid those. I also may avoid if you're doing like a really dark beer and you want to save that yeast and pitch it directly into like a light colored beer. So some of those instances might be a case where doing that rinsing just to kind of clean up the yeast a little bit, maybe remove some of the color, remove some matter, might be beneficial. So let's look at my process for this recent batch of a blonde ale. In this case, I was using some of my favorite yeast, White Labs WOP 530. It's a nice Trappist yeast that I really love. It's the Westmalle strain. So I pitched my starter into my batch of Belgian Blonde. Oh, but wait, we need to back up a little first. So this yeast was fairly old, so my first step was to build up a starter. I want to make sure I'm pitching enough healthy yeast. Oh, but wait, we need to back up further than that. So where did this yeast even come from? So using my high-tech blue tape labeling system, I see this yeast originally came from a batch from May of 2021. The revived label indicates that I built up a starter in November of 2022 and then saved the yeast from that starter into a jar. So we're talking yeast that may be 3 years old. So I'm not going to claim using yeast that old, this many reuses, or using this time between batches as really best practices, but I think this does show that yeast really is pretty hardy. So I don't have any footage from that revived step that I did. Basically I made a starter, saved off some of the yeast, put it in the jar, so it's not much to show there. But I did find some information from that May 21 batch that turned up some kind of interesting information. This was actually yeast that I harvested from a double that I brewed in January of 2021. So I'm not positive that was a fresh pack or if that was harvested from a prior batch. I think it was harvested. But back in May of 2021, I made a large 1.5 liter starter. I pitched 1 liter of that starter into the batch of double, and I set aside a ½ liter of that starter to use as a future batch. So basically there I was using a technique called an overbuild starter. But then that sounds like a topic for another video. So now we can get back to 2023 in this batch of Belgian Blonde that I made. So I made a basic 1 liter starter using 1 liter of filtered water and 100 grams of Pilsen Light DME. Any light colored DME will work. The simple 100 grams of DME to 1 liter of water ratio is so easy that even I use metric for this step. Then, adding a little yeast nutrient, that's an optional step. I generally boil the mix for 5 to 10 minutes in a saucepan, then chill down the starter wort in my sink. Cold tap water will knock off most of the heat, then switching over to an ice bath gets me the rest of the way. So now that we're past the boiling stage, sanitation is important. First, make sure your equipment is nice and clean. I don't go too fancy on my sanitation process here. I am sure to clean and sanitize my hands between touching things. I use Star San to sanitize most items. And then I use this 70% isopropyl alcohol spray around the rim of the yeast jar. I don't really want to spray a bunch of Star San and get that into the yeast. I pour off the majority of the liquid above the yeast layer, leave it enough to make a slurry with the yeast. I then transfer my chilled starter wort into a jar. You could use a $40 lab flask for this, but a Costco pickle jar works well for this frugal brewer. I then add some of the yeast slurry. How much slurry to add? So I tend to target around 20 milliliters of slurry. Here I see I added 30 milliliters or 6 teaspoons, and I probably could have just dumped it all in. And then I add in the stir bar and get the mix spinning on my stir plate. I make sure to put the lid on the jar very loosely. This way the CO2 can get out, but no contaminants can fall into the jar. So I'm definitely not a stir plate expert, so I've owned this one for maybe a year. I've only used it a few times. I know sometimes with the stirring action, it can be kind of hard to tell if fermentation is getting started. Here, at about 5 hours after pitching, I see some signs of activity. The bubbles are a little bit more apparent when I turn off the stir plate. In about 1.5 days, fermentation looks nice and healthy. The starter has this nice milky appearance from the extra yeast and suspension. So then a little after 2 days on the stir plate, I cold crash the starter in my fridge. The next day is brew day. Here's what the yeast looks like. This is exactly what I want to see. Most of the yeast is settled out, and there's a layer of healthy looking white yeast. So I save off a little bit of the starter wort in a glass to make sure and taste it, just to make sure there's not any strong off flavors. At this point, it's probably going to taste quite yeasty. It's not going to be the greatest because it's kind of warm and flat, but it shouldn't be sour or have any real off flavors. I then pour out the majority of the spent wort, leaving enough to make a slurry to pour into the fermenter. So now we're back at the point where it's time to pitch that yeast into a batch of beer. So make sure you use a magnet to avoid fermenting your stir bar. It's a common mistake. So one of my motivations for brewing this beer, the Belgian Single, was building up yeast to pitch into a Belgian Quad, which I did brew. So that sounds like an interesting topic for another video. So the Belgian Blonde, I think it turned out great. I've got a couple competitions coming up. I'm going to submit this beer and see how it does. So I already got one video on my channel using a shaken not stirred method to make a starter. Check out that video. I hope to put out some other content on yeast starters, some other ways to reuse yeast and save yeast, look kind of an overview of some of the different methods. If you're interested in those type of videos, if you want to see how that Belgian Quad turned out, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can find your way back here. And cheers!